Hello.
Hey,
how are you?
I'm doing so great. I have to tell you that one of our faithful listeners, Pat, I know you're out there. I know you're listening, and I appreciate you giving me permission to share this. He texted me recently and said, you know what? I really needed Psalm fill in the blank this week. Thank you guys for doing the Summer in the Psalm series. And oh my gosh, that really just boosted my mood. And we hope that this podcast is beneficial to people. And then when somebody says, hey, I'm following along and I'm reading the Psalms and I'm finding value in the Psalms, thank you guys for setting this up. Like it was so good.
That's what it's all about, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you, Pat, for your encouragement. It means more than you know. Yeah. But that's how I'm doing. How are you?
You know, I am a little bitter for a very petty reason.
Okay. All right. I am ready for your pettiness.
I grabbed whatever the new flavor of Mountain Dew is. I forget what it's called. I threw away the bottle and now it's in a cup, so I don't remember what it's called. But anyway, I am a huge Mountain Dew fan. And every time they come out with a new flavor, I'm like, oh, that's great. And then I have it and think to myself, that is nowhere near as good as the original. And I'm always disappointed. And I think this is the problem with having a great product and then trying to come out with a bunch of new products. It's really hard to live up to the original because Mountain Dew tastes amazing. And I have yet to, they're not even close. None of them. So I'm a little sad that I don't have a second favorite soda now because that's what I was really hoping for.
Yes, I actually agree with you on all points here. I love Mountain Dew more than any middle-aged man should. But I don't drink it very often. I feel like it's gasoline or something. Like it's just really going to rev me up. So I steer clear of it for the most part, but every now and then I do dive in. But here's the thing. We've been friends for 20 plus years. I had no idea you were a Mountain Dew fan.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yep. Big fan. Also try not to drink it too often. For me, it's not the caffeine. That actually, as I'm getting older, a little bit of caffeine, and by a little bit, I mean whatever Mountain Dew has in it, actually helps regulate my system in a weird way. But I do not need all the sugars and things that are in soda. So, but while health tips with two middle-aged men is a great thing to get from our podcast.
Oh yeah.
I'm guessing it's probably not what you called about.
Nor why anybody tuned in today. They didn't look at the title of today's episode and go, you know what? They're talking about Mountain Dew and I can't wait.
Yes. I don't think that happened.
No. So I texted you earlier in the week and I was, we're in the middle of our Summer in the Psalm series, and every now and then we want to make one of the Psalms our main topic of conversation. And I was so struck by Psalm 84 this week. I have questions about it. I just love this about it. There's so many things I want to talk about from Psalm 84. So I texted you earlier in the week and said, we have to just talk about this. And as I understand it, in our pre-recording conversation, you have already dived in. Divin? We've done this before.
I have divin. Yes, we're bringing it on. Divin is our word. We're going to get it into the OED. We are.
Okay, so you have divin into this text already this week.
I have. I was super excited when you texted because my thought for this week was going to come directly from this psalm. And I just highlighted it and left it as a question. And then you texted me and that invited me to dig into the psalm and some of the aspects of the psalm a little bit more deeply. And I just find myself being somewhat blown away at the richness of this psalm. And now I have lots of thoughts and a host of questions, and I am super excited. What?
Yeah, it was a nice little pun, a host of questions, because my very first question about this is, what in the world is this hosts thing? So I thought you were making a pun there.
Oh, if I was a good journalist, I would have used that as an intentional transition moment. But so speaking of the host of questions that I have, Josh from Oregon, what is your first question about the text?
That was not awkward in any way.
I'm smooth.
All right. So my question, and I texted you this in advance. What is going on with this phrase, the Lord of Hosts? And so we're actually going to make this the title of the episode, I believe, which is the Hebrew characters that you see out there says Yahweh Sabaoth, or some would say Sabaoth. The B and the V is kind of interchangeable. But anyway, Yahweh Sabaoth, which just means God of hosts or God of angel armies is how some translate it. It's Sabaoth is a word that comes from the word for warfare. So it's God Almighty, God the warrior God, like God the strong one, God the commander of the angel armies. Whatever it means, it kind of fits in that genre somewhere. But I'm very confused as to why it is so prominent in this psalm. It's in verse 1. It's in the very last verse, which is verse 12. And then Yahweh Sabaoth also comes up in verse 3. And then Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh God of hosts, Yahweh Elohim Sabaoth is in verse 8. So it's very prominent, but this is a whole psalm about how, man, I really long to be in the house of the Lord. And that just seems like a safe, good place to be. And I delight in that. What is this warfare language and why is it so prominent in this psalm?
Such a fascinating question. And it is underscored, I think, by one of the things that you mentioned that I did not notice until you mentioned it, which is that the psalm begins and ends with this reference to the character of God. And whenever that sort of inclusio happens, it's probably telling us that this idea is more than a passing thought. Right?
Yeah.
And because of the way that this happens 4 times and the other 2 are sort of in the places that they are, it actually makes me wonder if there's some sort of chiastic structure here where sort of the structure of it is the first and last things balance each other, and then the second and second to last, and third to last until you get to the middle one thing. And that is really the emphasis point of this poem. But I am not good enough at understanding those things to know. But at least we can say the fact that it opens and closes the psalm means whatever the point of the psalm, it is immersed in this one truth about who God is. And that makes it wildly important for understanding the psalm. So I'm curious, what is your initial take on this?
Well, I have to say for the longest time, it was just a complete open question. Because for me, as I look at this psalm, and it's talking about how much this individual desires to be in God's house, and I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than, be the invited guest at the banquet for the wicked or something, it's a little bit ESV, a little bit Eugene Peterson there. But there's this longing to be with God kind of thing. And so the mood that strikes me most, what I would have put in here is not Yahweh, the almighty God of warfare, the commander of the angel armies, but God, the loving one, God, the faithful one, God's hesed, his covenantal faithfulness. I would have put something a little bit more gushy. I mean, right?
This is like the gushiest psalm ever.
Yeah, exactly. And instead, I'm painting God as like a warrior clad in armor in front of a host of warriors. And that's not gushy. So that was my initial take. My second take has been, maybe this means that this is an incredibly safe place to be. So scholars believe that this was a psalm that people would sing as they marched to Jerusalem on kind of like a pilgrimage to the temple kind of a thing. And as they're marching to the temple and as they're anticipating being in God's house, right? They come around the corner and there is this great city of Jerusalem and there is the temple, and it's such an exciting moment. So maybe they're looking at the defensive walls of Jerusalem sitting up on a hill, the fact that this is the Lord above all lords, the God above all gods, and they're going to his house. And maybe there is this mightiness to it. And then there's this safety and security in being able to go into his house. Maybe that's associated with it, but I don't know. That's just my second take.
Can I throw a hypothesis your way and
Please
see if it rings true?
All right.
I am going to be on very thin ice here because I am going to suggest that translating this Lord of the Angel Armies is wrong.
Oh, okay.
As a complete novice in Hebrew, this is a wildly dangerous thing to do.
I can't wait to hear what you want to say, though.
Okay, so here's what I did. I went and looked up this word Sabaoth just to see all the different ways it's used in the Bible. So I just got a list from Genesis to Malachi of all the places it's used and how it's used. And I really only went through up to the Psalms and just started looking through. And so there's really 3 ways that this gets used. One is that this gets used for the host of heaven, right? The Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first place I think this word comes up in the Bible. This started me thinking about what the connotations of the word are, because from that, I would not assume that an army connotation is necessary. So I wondered if the word is broader than army.
Okay.
The same way our English word means host as in a army host, but it has broadened out to just mean a lot.
Sure.
So that's the one way. The second way is kind of the main way that it's used, which is the army host. And there's 1,000 times it's used. I don't know how many, hundreds of dozens, I don't know, lots of times it is used. It is kind of this common word for the commander, whether speaking of God or speaking of just a human commander. But if you're saying the commander and his army, you would say the commander and his Sabaoth, right? So there's this clearly obvious army idea. And the third one, and this comes up almost as many times in the Pentateuch, is sort of summed up in Exodus 7:4, where God says, I believe to Pharaoh, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. And I think this is significant because if this psalm is a traveling psalm, this is a pilgrimage psalm, all through the desert pilgrimage of the people of Israel, they are called the Sabaoth of God. That's his word for them. And here's what I'm going to hypothesize. This is where that's all just data, but now I'm going to make an interpretive leap. When we think of God's army, and that's really what the words mean, right? Yahweh Sabaoth means the Lord of hosts. Literally, it just means Yahweh, God's name, the Yahweh of the armies.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And Peterson adds the word angel to make sure that we all know it's not talking about just a bunch of people. It doesn't just mean a crowd. It means an army.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what I think is interesting. I am going to hypothesize that when God shows up to do war, we think of him coming to do war in a very American, Rambo kind of, if If God showed up to a standoff with Pharaoh and Pharaoh says, "Oh yeah, you and what army?" We want God to show up with this decked out bunch of angels who have like bazookas and like straps of ammunition crisscrossing them and like swords and right?
Yeah.
This is what we want. I think if we were to ask Gideon, what kind of army does God want to show up with? God's approach to leading a battle is not to show up with a great army. Instead, it is to show up with a ragtag bunch of refugees that make it look amazing when he wins anyway. And so, whether it is, like I said, with Gideon or with, I think there's sort of a tongue in cheek joke of calling the refugees coming out of Egypt a Sabaoth of God. There's a joke there. But it is a joke that points to me, and God says, "Me and what army? The only army I need is the refugees behind me, and I can still take you."
So this term, Yahweh Sabaoth, gets used some 280 times or something like that in the Old Testament. And it seems like a formal title for God. And so do you believe that something akin to that was in their minds as they referred to God as Yahweh Sabaoth, kind of the God that's in charge of this ragtag group of people?
Yeah. Yes is too strong of a word. But if we believe that the Jewish people had a historical consciousness, it would seem reasonable to think that embedded in this term was the remembrance of being a refugee people saved by the power of God, who is the Lord not of angel armies, but of refugee armies. And that profoundly enhances his glory, not diminishing his power. Because the point that God is always trying to make consistently all the way up to the cross is, I don't need what you think might is. And I guess that's what I'm thinking is, I'm guessing our human definition of might is seeping into the way we read this phrase when it shouldn't. And I think that would make a ton of sense in the context of this one psalm in particular. Here we are, a bunch of people traveling on our way to the temple, which is an intentional reenactment of leaving Egypt and coming to the promised land. And who are we traveling with? What gives meaning to this journey? It is the fact that we, in all our everyday common humanity, with all the boringness of being a butcher or a farmer or whatever it was I was back in Bethlehem or wherever I came from, I am traveling with Yahweh Sabaoth. And we are the only army he needs.
I do like that imagery, and I like how that would shape the psalmist's perspective in writing this psalm. Like, I long to come to the house of Yahweh Sabaoth, the mighty God that is over this ragtag group of people and decided to call it his own. I feel like that gives a sense of longing and a sense of perspective that I elsewhere see in this psalm. So it at least helps.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. And even just to throw one more piece of it, to add to the fact that this is the kind of ultimate meaning of this. Way back in seminary, one of my classes on the Old Testament, we studied the tabernacle and the origins of the design of the tabernacle. And in comparison with other, I don't want to say buildings because it was a tent, but other similar structures in the general era and geography that this was being built, my professor was making the argument that the tabernacle was an army commander's tent. That's what this was supposed to be seen as. Not a palace, but an army commander's tent. which again would kind of build into this idea that the Lord of the armies, and it just kind of, think about what this means in reference to the Beatitudes that we talked about. It just turns the world upside down. Suddenly, the blessed, the insiders in the army of God are these outcasts.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a goofy analogy, but it's like saying between me and Michael Jordan, we have 6 NBA championships.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yes, that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for saying in 30 seconds the point that I was trying to make for the last 15 minutes. That's exactly what I think. I think that is the joke that God is making when he calls his people his army.
Yeah. It definitely fits theologically with the rest of Scripture. And so I don't think you could be terribly off. I think anytime we're trying to determine what was in the minds of the original author, we're always on somewhat shaky ground. Mm-hmm. And so I would, in that light, like to explore that further and maybe read some of these passages where Sabaoth is used, and particularly where Yahweh Sabaoth is used, to see if that sense of it might exist in other passages. But I can see it in this one for sure.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Like, we always have to remember the difference between facts and interpretations. It is a fact that God refers to his people during their exit from Egypt as his Sabaoth. Now, how I interpret that in light of the other ways that this seems to be used, the fact is the fact. My interpretation is always in question, right? And distinguishing between those two things, for me, is just one of those important theological steps of having the wisdom or the grace to acknowledge even the most long-standing interpretation. It's the facts behind the interpretation that are true, not the interpretation itself.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'm impressed. I asked you a question over text, and you did a lot of work to try to come up with an answer for me. And so I appreciate that greatly. But you teased us earlier in the episode and said that your thought was originally going to come from Psalm 84. So what were you thinking about this psalm?
Yeah, and this, I'm curious on your take here. This is from the end, and it's a Eugene Petersonism, which
we've had a lot of those this year.
Oh my goodness. Which, my favorite thing, and I know I've said this before, whether I end up thinking Peterson is right or wrong in the way that he translates something, reading the Bible with Eugene Peterson inspires me to think more carefully and more intentionally about what the Bible is saying. And so I am deeply grateful for that.
100%.
It's just such a fascinating reminder. I guess it reveals to me all the times where I am taking for granted that I know what the Bible is saying, when in fact I am assuming what the Bible is saying.
Right.
He just so often kind of uncovers that for me. But the thing that I was really intrigued by, the second to last line in his translation says, he doesn't scrimp with his traveling companions. It's smooth sailing all the way with God of the angel armies. Now, we've talked about this God of the angel armies part, but I'm just intrigued by this line. He doesn't scrimp with his traveling companions. And when I look at the ESV, the line it's clearly coming from is, no good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly. And I'm curious, what do you think about the way that he translates, no good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly, translating that into, he doesn't scrimp with his traveling companions? What do you think about that?
Well, I actually think more about the second part of that than the first, because I really appreciate how Eugene Peterson brings out more of the intended meaning, in my opinion, of this idea of walking uprightly. I grew up with a very works-oriented mindset when it came to my relationship with God, that I had to try to be perfect as God is perfect, that I had to repent of my sin and be in good standing with God, that righteousness, uprightness, holiness mattered greatly to God. And all of those things are true, but they are true in a certain sense. And I took them as very much like, I have a big responsibility here to get my act together. Otherwise, God is displeased with me. And I think instead what Eugene Peterson is bringing out is this idea of traveling companions. When am I righteous, holy, upright, blameless, pure before God? It's when I am traveling with God. He is my righteousness. He is my salvation. He is my justifier. He exonerates me from my sin. He redeems me from my sin. He does all that, right? Again, like between me and Michael Jordan, we have 6 championships. He does all that. And so what does it mean to walk uprightly? It means to be a faithful traveling companion with God. That's when I am walking uprightly. So for me, it takes the onus off of me to be like, well, God's prepared to give you good things, but you've got this thing over here and you're not doing it right. So I'm sorry, you don't qualify. And that feels just crummy to me. Like, oh, well, I'm glad those people get all these good things from God. I guess I don't. Eugene Peterson changed it in the way that I think needed to be changed.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I find that to be incredibly helpful because it reveals the way in which I was thinking the same way you were thinking. There is something very independent about the way I hear the word upright. It's about me and my relationship with the law.
Oh,
not
yes.
about me and my relationship with God.
Yes. Yes. Well said. Well, again, with the 30-second recap. Well done.
It's great to have somebody else say it so that then you can process it, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and because it's me and the law, I either succeed or fail. To think of the upright as the traveling companions of God, because it is God who makes us upright and God who empowers us to choose uprightness itself. I think that's great. I find that incredibly helpful. And again, lighter. I think when I hear the word upright, my heart sinks a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not consistent with the tone of the psalm.
No. Yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah, to translate it this other way, I'm like, oh, that is a captivating and kind of joy-inspiring image, to be traveling companions with God. And I love the idea that pilgrimage was an intentional part of the Jewish experience. If this is true, pilgrimage was a spiritual discipline that was practicing being traveling companions with God. Sort of a microcosm where they learned some important lessons. And none of that comes to light for me when I hear the word upright.
Right. Well, and even this is where translation makes such a difference. And that's also going to be my thought later on, by the way. But, at the very end of the psalm, the ESV translates, blessed is the one who trusts in you, which is a perfectly good translation. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, going back to our conversation about Psalm 1, this is Esrei. This is not Baruch. So this is happy is the one, blessed, joyful. There is well-being in the one who has trusted in you. And again, with the tone that shifts for me. For me, this is a happier tone. This is I will have a blessed, good, happy, fulfilling life by trusting in God, rather than blessed. And blessed sometimes for me, again, has this moral sense, like God is only going to bless certain types of people, and maybe I'm going to get a blessing and maybe I'm not. I don't know. It's almost like there is a happy sense that you get when you are putting your trust in God and you're following him. You're on a traveling, you're God's traveling companion.
Again, with the kind of silly analogies, if I say you're a good person, that has one emotional tone. If I say, boy, that was a good steak, that has a different emotional tone that speaks to a level of satisfaction
Yes.
and sort of savoriness of the experience.
Yep.
That I think when we use the word in a purely moral way, we drain out of the word by accident.
Yes.
And we do this all the time, right? Like you and I go on vacation every other year or thereabouts together with our families. And if I were to describe that as a morally upright experience, that would be sad. Right? Like, man, yeah, it's great that we didn't sin together.
Or to say it like this, right? If you do this, your relationship, your friendship will be blessed. This isn't like some blessing from God that comes from going on a trip together. No, there is a satisfaction. There's a joy. There is a blessing in going on vacation together. It's a different sense of the same word. And like you said, we don't want to drain the emotional energy out of it by boiling it down purely to the moral.
Yeah, it reminds me, if I was saying pilgrimage is a microcosm of something, it reminds me of a buddy of mine, and stop me if I've told this story on the podcast before, but a buddy of mine, Frank, who passed away many years ago, he'd lived a really tough life. And he was still dealing with the consequences in his health and his finances and his relationships of that bad living all the way till the day he died. And one day we were sitting there and I think I was driving him home, and he was talking about following Jesus. And he said, it's not that following Jesus is easy. Anybody who tries to tell you that following Jesus is easier is like selling you something. Man, the difference is at least you're not doing it alone. And he said it with such heart in his voice that you could hear the fact that traveling through life with God was good. And good didn't equal easy. It equaled good. It was a thing worth savoring even when it was hard. Yes. Because it was together with God.
Well, I think you see that even in this psalm, right? And it talks about going through the valley of Baca, right? This desolate valley, and God turns it to springs. There's springs of water that you come across, and even the pools start filling up with water. Like God somehow makes deserted valleys a good thing. Following God is hard and it is good all at the same time.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. I'm sure we can say 1,000 things about Psalm 84, and we've just scratched the surface. But I do want to turn to the audience and say, we get a lot of comments from some of our faithful listeners that, hey, I listened to your podcast the other day, and boy, I just debated with you guys and argued with you and made snarky comments the whole time. And it's like, oh, well, that's fantastic. Well, what did you say? Oh, I don't remember. Or I don't know. It just, I just disagreed with you on this point. Okay. What did you disagree with? This would be awesome. I would love to keep the conversation going just by asking, how would you like to argue with us? And we've given a lot of interesting takes on this psalm that may or may not hold water. So what did you think of it? And as you dive into the psalm, what do you make of it? How do you experience this psalm and the God that it so magnifies? I just want to know your thoughts.
Yeah. So here is the request. Pause right now, which means you're not going to hear the second part of this request. But then when you unpause to find out what else you were supposed to do, pull over if you're driving, or if you're kayaking, you can do it while kayaking, or whatever you're doing, just take a breath stop for a minute, go to Facebook, go to our post today, whatever quote or comment or whatever it is, ignore what we posted, but think about your strongest response to our episode and type that into the comments so that we get to hear it. Even if it doesn't seem like it relates to the actual post that we posted. We just want to hear your thoughts. And so we would love to hear them, particularly if they're arguments with us.
Yes. Yeah. We don't, by the way, we're not inviting necessarily an argument. We're not going to cut you down and tell you how much you're wrong. We just enjoy the conversation about how to understand scripture better. So we want to keep it going.
Exactly.
So, well, that has been our thoughts from Psalm 84. But we've been in the middle of a Summer in the Psalm series for a while, and I haven't gotten to hear other thoughts from you, Josh from Missouri. What else are you thinking about?
This is a continuation of a thought that we've talked about at various points. We have at times in various conversations raised the question of how do you be an informed Christian in a world in which the media is so often unchristian in the way that they speak? It's, and I'm not criticizing the left or the right, I'm criticizing both here. The pundits speak in ways that I do not want to have rub off on me, and so I refuse to listen to them. I just find them, from a Christian point of view, anybody who is that attacking, that mean-spirited, and that angry, I find that offensive. Far more offensive than most rated R movies. So I ask myself, how do I stay informed? And I have a couple of resources that I've come across this week that I found really helpful. The first of these, and the one that actually I've loved for quite a while, is the Holy Post. Have you ever listened to Holy Post?
I know that that's Phil Vischer's podcast, but I have never listened to it.
Okay, so let me give you the full list of people who work on Holy Post. It is Phil Vischer, the guy who kind of spearheaded the birth of VeggieTales. Then it is Skye Jethani, who is the Christianity Today leadership editor and the author of several just breathtakingly good books. Then it is Esau McCulley, who wrote Reading the Bible While Black. Am I getting that title right?
It was just Reading While Black, but yeah.
Reading.
It is specifically Reading the Bible While Black, but that's not the title.
So he's, again, a brilliant mind. And then Caitlin Chess, who is currently working on her PhD in political theology at Duke.
Okay.
So this is some people.
Yeah.
And they bat around cultural kind of things that bump into Christianity in American culture in some really fun ways that I think are generally deeply respectful, but also generally thoughtful. But it gets better. One of their guests that they have on a regular basis is a guy named David French. Have you ever heard of David French?
No.
So let me give you David French's CV in a nutshell. French is a trained constitutional scholar. He has written for the New York Times, which is a very liberal publication, and he is a regular speaker on the Dispatch podcast, which is a very conservative podcast that walks carefully through Supreme Court decisions and what they mean. And he is a passionate follower of Jesus. So he's this great Christian who manages to both be loved by and offend people on the left and be loved by and offend people on the right. So whenever he's on Holy Post, they do it on Fridays. And so they call it French Friday. because his name is David French.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
he just talks about political stuff. Then he also has the podcast I referred to a moment ago, The Dispatch, which is just he and his co-host processing out what the Supreme Court is doing and what it means. And I just appreciate the thoughtfulness, the intentionality, and frequently the empathy he offers to people who disagree with him. And I have found both of these resources just to be helpful in the I'd like to be an informed citizen, but I can't stomach CNN or Fox News because I think they're so embarrassing that I just feel gross when I listen to them.
Sure. Are those something like great resources?
Yeah, they're amazing. But what about you? What have you been thinking about?
Well, so somewhat of a life update, if you will. My friend John and I finally, after 1.5 years, finished translating the book of Esther.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so, when you only work on it once a week together, and then sometimes you have to cancel, it takes you a while. So anyway, we finally made it through, and our next project that he actually recommended was to translate select Psalms.
Ooh.
Which is phenomenal. I don't think our translating is going to in any way line up with our Summer in the Psalms series. So unfortunately, I don't think these are going to correlate too well. But we did start with Psalm 1. And because you and I have already talked through so much of Psalm 1, I wanted to give you just a couple of interpretive decisions that I made in my translation and then read you my translation. Is that okay?
I would love that.
So we've already talked about Esrei in versus Baruch and how that is not necessarily like blessed is a good translation, but it's not my translation. So I did change that to happy. And then there is this word that talks about the gathering place is how I translate it of scoffers. And John was pointing out that this is not the normal formal word for assembly, like you would assemble the whole tribes of Israel. It's a different word. And so I translated that as gathering place rather than like the assembly. And then I think all modern translations use the capital L-O-R-D to translate Yahweh. I understand the argument on both sides. I really do. So I'm gracious toward anybody who disagrees. And I'm even hesitant on my own position here. But in a desire to actually know God, I think it is important to know him by the name he gave us. And if scripture says Yahweh, I think we need to translate it as Yahweh, because there are so many personal acts that Yahweh does that I feel like it depersonalizes Yahweh to say the Lord. And so that's my interpretive choice. I understand that a lot of people do not make that interpretive choice. And so if this is offensive to any, I'm sorry, that is not what I intend to do. This is genuinely motivated by a desire to know God more and to know particularly the intimate way that he communicates and interacts with people. And I think using the name he gave us and showing when he is the divine actor, the personal agent in that action, is a helpful way of knowing God better. So that's my interpretive choice there. And so the last thing I want to highlight from my translation choice is where it says Torah. I don't think it necessarily just means God's law. I actually think it's a broader sense where it's talking about the instruction of God. And so it's not, I don't want to confine the word to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. I believe it speaks to more than that. So that's, again, my interpretive choice, and you're going to see that come through in my translation. So with those caveats in mind, here is my translation. Happy is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, and does not stand in the way of sinners, and does not sit in the gathering place of scoffers. But he delights in Yahweh's instruction, and on his instruction he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted beside streams of water, that gives its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and all that he does prospers. Not so the wicked, for they are like chaff which the wind blows. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For Yahweh considers the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will die off. Again, it's not all that different from any other translation, but it does have some of those key differences. And I think, to me, they matter. And to me, they make a difference in how I understand the psalm and how I relate to it. And so I guess my general thought is not, hey, look at my translation. It's much more, look at all the decisions that an interpreter, a translator has to make. And boy, all of those decisions add up to big things in my mind.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you said that you just finished translating what book?
Esther.
Esther. Okay. So when is the West Coast translation of Esther going to be available to the public?
Never. Yeah. Esther was so hard. It was so hard. It is post-exilic Hebrew, which is very, very different. So we started in Genesis. And so we went from like one end of the Hebrew spectrum to the other. There's probably like over 1,000 years has gone by between when one was written and the other. And so the Hebrew is very different. Some of the constructions are really vague. Some of the word choices are so unique that scholars are not entirely certain what the definition of some of these words are. And at times there was really no way to bring across the idea word for word. You really had to go all Eugene Peterson on it. So no, I'm not going to be publishing that at all. It's I'm practicing Hebrew translation.
Well, I love when your continual commitment to keeping your Hebrew fresh seeps into our conversations, because there's a lot to gain from that.
Yeah. And, you spoke earlier about how it's kind of risky when a non-Hebrew scholar talks about Hebrew. I feel the exact same way. Keeping my Hebrew fresh is a right way to say it. I am certainly not a Hebrew or Greek scholar. I just want to be in them for the rest of my life. And this is what it takes to do that.
That's awesome. I love it. I'm glad I benefit from it.
All right. It's time to change things up entirely.
Yes. Are you ready for a Which Josh question?
Lay it on me.
All right, here we go. Which Josh has fond memories with Foam Dome the Gnome?
All right, so this is totally me, Josh from Oregon.
No idea what this means.
I can't believe I've never talked to you about Foam Dome the Gnome. So this goes back. This is a family thing. We hold Foam Dome to be very dear in our family. So Shelley bought years ago, when my oldest was probably 3 years old. She bought this tiny little plastic gnome that's no more than like 4 inches tall. And he's got like a little backpack on. He's definitely ready for travel. And the idea is that you take him on all of your travels and you take pictures of him on your vacations. But it also has like a unique serial number at the bottom. And so it's supposedly like you can go to this website and post pictures of your gnome in all of these different places and kind of track their history. Or you could even like leave the gnome at a hostel, and the next person could pick it up and go to this website and be like, oh, look at all these adventures. I guess I'll take this gnome on more adventures, and then I'll leave it somewhere for somebody else to take it. So she bought this little gnome, and then she pulls it out of its package. And it was like one of those evenings where your 3-year-old is just running circles around the room and just over and over and over. He's just doing crazy things. And so Shelley pulls it out of the package and she's like, look at this gnome I got for all of our travels. What should we name him? And my son, bouncing off the walls, he's like, Foam Dome the Gnome. And we're like, that is a fantastic name. And so, yes, that is Foam Dome the Gnome. And he has gone on lots of vacations. We have like lots and lots of pictures of Foam Dome in the oddest locations you can think of.
That's amazing. I love that. I love family traditions in general, but that is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Foam Dome the Gnome. He's great.
I think that's brilliant. Well, hey, you ready for another conversation next week?
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you then.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.